Okay, students, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think this week is something that has the bulk of the content. And so we're going to kind of have to march through it in a way that I hope is still helpful to you. Now, one of the ways, I guess the way I want to start is with the very famous myth of the metals. And in order for a city to be able to identify with each other, right, as sort of the purpose of life, they need to believe that there's something that makes them the same. They need to identify the other person as a part of themselves. And this, you might call it the in contemporary political theory recognition. But it's also maybe the idea that humans have an easier time sacrificing for people who they think are like them. And so, what they do when the end of the educational system has come into being, you eventually have the person who makes the curriculum, and that person becomes the guardian, the philosopher guardian, basically, not a soldier guardian. And then from that point on, I think it's best to call the soldiers auxiliaries, aides, or helpers. And now you have a three-tiered system. In this three-tiered system, the person who makes the educational curriculum that makes the city just is the philosopher or the ruler. And they are going to be called gold, the metal gold. There are auxiliaries who we've talked about already, the soldiers. They're going to be silver. And then there are craftsmen, and they're going to be bronze. In the myth of the metals, each of these types of people is different, obviously, but they're all still metals. And they're all still coming from the same ground, the Mother Earth. So this is basically a reflection to try to get people in the city who are different with different rules and roles to see the people who they are different with them as a sibling, right? As a part of a family. Now, that division, that three-part division of the city, means that of, philosopher, guardian, auxiliary, and then producer, means that you've got the gold, the silver, the metal, bronze medal class. Okay, that is the end of the construction of the city and speech. It's built now. So from this point on, what we're going to be doing is studying it to try to understand what justice is. And it turns out that every part of the city can be discussed with reference to some virtue. The whole city can also be discussed with reference to a virtue. And remember that a virtue is what helps something do its function excellently. This is where you get introduced to the four virtues, the four cardinal virtues, which are important for the rest of Western political thought, especially in the ancient and medieval period. Um, the four virtues are going to be wisdom, courage, temperance, also called moderation, and justice. So before I launch into how these different virtues work, I want to call your attention to an interlude before that, where what happens is Adeimantus brings up the question of whether or not the people who live in this kind of city will be happy. Um, and he even talks about how even the ones who are the most skilled might not be happy. And he, for some reason, Adeimantus thinks that if you're so virtuous, you should be able to be happy. And so he's particularly concerned when the higher castes are not going to be happy either. This is the idea I want us to keep returning to, the question of the happiness of the people in the city. Because what Plato says is that you have to look for happiness in the whole, not in a part, but in a whole. So, from a political perspective, I think that one thing to keep in mind is that in a city or a regime, you don't want one part of the regime to be happy while the rest are not. It might be better in some ways to have everybody have sort of reasonable discontents than to have one side have everything in resentment be breeding in the meantime. I also think if you're thinking about it in terms of the soul as a whole might be able to be said to be happy, but are the parts of the soul going to be able to be called happy individually? And I think the answer is going to be a lot of times no. But this will make more sense as I can continue to go. I just wanted to put that out here for you before we continue. It's sort of the introduction of this idea that for Plato, maybe on earth, happiness is not obtainable or not perfectly obtainable. So let's start with the virtue of wisdom. I'm sorry if this is kind of a low energy lecture. It's hard to give a lecture, I think, on a grad level without talking to somebody, without seeing someone's face. But that's okay. I'm just letting you know that I'm apologizing for it being kind of low energy. So wisdom is not what you think about it being. Like, wisdom is not just any kind of knowledge. We don't call somebody wise just because they memorize the periodic table. Wisdom is basically good judgment. And it's an ability to understand the higher things and apply them to the lower in this context. So I think a great example of wisdom is, in the myth of King Solomon, where the baby gets split, or almost gets split. You've probably heard this myth. There are two women. They both claim to be the mother of a baby. King Solomon, who's known for his wisdom, says, okay, we'll split the baby in two, and whichever of you you can each have one, right? That way I don't have to decide who the mother is. And the real mother says, no, don't do that. She can have him. And that was a sign to the King Solomon that was exactly who the mother was, because the real mother would not want any harm to come to the baby. This is an example of wisdom. I think it's sort of intangible. It's not just the memorization of a fact, but it's being able to look at particular situations and apply knowledge skillfully, and in a way that leads to a good outcome. You can see how wisdom would be important in a lot of areas of life, but especially in politics. So the wisdom is the virtue of the sort of smallest part of the city, but the one that's at the highest point of the hierarchy. That is the guardian philosophers. Courage is also different than what we normally think about. Courage is something, I think, in our culture, we normally think of courage as recklessness, as sort of like, I'm going to do that no matter what the cost. I remember when I was younger, my cousin died in a drunk driving accident, and which was, of course, terrible. And he was very sort of, he was kind of a wild person. He was a lot of fun, and he would take a lot of risks. And, but that was part of the reason that he died that night. Not that it was his fault, but this was another kind of risk or adventure to him. And when I went to the funeral, I remember all of his friends praising him for being so wild and so brave. They put those two things in the same sentence. I remember thinking, I wish that people wouldn't have told him that it was brave to act that way. He was brave in other ways, but recklessness is not being brave. And I think that the Plato shows what courage actually is, which is keeping the strength of your opinion, your right opinion, your correct opinion in a time of duress. So we've probably all been in a place where there's a promise we made or something that we thought we would always do. And then we get to a certain crossroad, and when we're at the crossroad, we're faced with that problem or that question or that sacrifice, and we don't have the nerve to do it. Um, why? Because we had a correct opinion, we had a sort of commitment to the good. And when it became hard to do that, we let go of that opinion. So, how's that courageous? Um, or why is that related to courage, I should say? Courage is having the right opinion about what to fear. So, he gives the example of color fast garments, which would have been purple at that time, garments that don't run. You hear that joke about the American flag, these colors don't run. Okay. So, colors, dyes can run. Like Rudy Giuliani's hair dye running down his face. But if you have a color fast garment, you have prepared the garment rigorously to receive the color. You go through this whole process, and then by the time the color finally makes it onto the material, it stays, it doesn't go away. And that he compares to courage, because somebody who has undergone a lot of rigorous formation, who has been sort of formed to receive the right opinion about what they should be afraid of and what they shouldn't, when the time comes, they will not falter. They will be color fast. And so courage can be something like Socrates in the jury's eyes, refusing to back down and admit he did something he didn't do. But courage can also be something like rushing into battle and not being overly afraid of death, even if it means you might die, if the battle is a just one. And so it turns out to be that courage is closely related to fear of death. Plato doesn't want us to not fear death. I think you might, he's not going to say it's unreasonable to be afraid of dying, but he wants us to have a proportionate fear of death and not see death as the worst thing that can happen to us. Courage, then, is a really complicated virtue. It's probably the most complicated of the ones that we're going to talk about. Moderation, also called temperance. Moderation is described as the mastery of the better part over the worse, the better part over the worse. And everything's very hierarchical in Plato. So for him, reason is higher than desire. That would be an example of the better part over the worse. It's associated with the producer class who make all of the things, right? And they need to have moderation in their desires, not to be totally full out consumers. But it actually turns out to characterize the interaction between all of the classes in the city. So far what you see is moderation belongs to the producers. You have wisdom belonging to the philosophers at the top, and courage belongs to the guardian and auxiliaries, so the middle, the soldiers. And then the whole of that, all of those parts, are going to be showing a dimension of the virtue of moderation. I'll give you an example of moderation to try to contextualize it for you, because I guess it can be kind of confusing. Like, I have celiac disease, so I can't eat gluten. And when, back in pre-corona times, when I could just go to my parents' house whenever I wanted, they would always, buy chicken, fried chicken. Not always, but maybe like once a month. And I love fried chicken. I especially love Popeyes. And I can't eat it anymore, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm talking to them and I'm listening to them, and we're having a good time. I can't eat what they're eating. That's fine. I remember one time someone praised me for that. They said, "Oh, you're so strong." Well, according to Plato, I would not be strong. I wouldn't be moderate either, because moderation would mean that I could be there watching other people eat this food, and that in doing so, I would not desire it. But what I'm doing actually when I'm watching them eat the food is I'm like, wow, that looks so good. I wish I was eating that. That's not moderation, because it's not mastery. I'm not in control. I'm having to fight the desire still, as opposed to the desire just not arising or being completely, even the threat of the desire overtaking me is a sign that I'm not being moderate. Okay. So the last virtue is justice. And justice is also not associated with one specific class, but with the whole. So give me a moment now to contrast between the two, justice and moderation, um, because they're easy to confuse, both in their definitions and in the role they play in the city. So they both refer to the whole of the city. Moderation seems to characterize how the classes should interact with each other in a balanced way. So the producers to the auxiliaries, what types of behaviors on their part would be called moderate? It would be the ones that show some restraint, right? And that have a sort of appropriate sense of what to expect from the other party and what to provide from them. Justice appears to be a virtue of the whole. Um, so, of the entire thing fitting together and functioning in a way that makes sense. And one of the things about justice, and why I hit the point so hard on the last lecture we had about the taste for justice, is because justice on this account, the complete city is whole. And you'd look at it and you'd say, that is a complete image. I don't know if you've heard of the concept from aesthetics of gestalt. It's sort of like a complete image, one that's finished. And it doesn't mean an image has to look the same. It's just it's not abbreviated. It's not interrupted. The whole city is complete. It's one. It forms a one, and that'll be important as we keep going. So actually, what you end up happening is, let me just sort of spell this out for you here. Actually, I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm not very technologically good, so I might not be able to do it, but let me try. Share screen. Okay, so this is what the beautiful city looks like. It's a pyramid, basically. The guardians are on the top, the auxiliaries are in the middle, the producers are on the bottom, because there's the most of them. The sort of skill that is needed by each part of the city is also listed. You need the guardians, they're going to rely on reason, on calculation. The auxiliaries are going to rely on spirited part of themselves. And the producers are going to rely on or be sort of shaped by the appetitive. What you see is that the city has these three natural classes, and you will find in the way that the city interacts with its parts and as a whole, what these virtues look like in practice. And what you come to see is that the city and the soul, okay, this actually turns out to be the soul. This turns out to be the city. The soul is going to have, here it is, like the city has, the guardian at the top who is wise, the courageous auxiliaries in the middle who are spirited, and the moderate producers who are appetitive. It turns out that the city is just the soul writ large. They're identical. The rational, the spirited, the appetitive, these are all parts of the human soul. So let's talk then about the human soul. We've talked about the way that these virtues break up into parts in the city. What does that mean for the soul, which is the same thing? The city is the soul writ large. And actually what you're going to see is that Socrates says we look to the city for the sake of a pattern, not to actually build the city, right? But to understand, to have a pattern of what justice would be, that it seems first and foremost we would imitate from our soul. So the rational part of ourselves calculates about what is good for the soul. This is where wisdom completes us, and it corresponds with the rulers. There's a conflict between reason and desire that's long-standing. We all know this. We've all gone through this. And which one matters, which one prevails in that conflict is what matters for justice ultimately. So an example of rationality and the appetitive part fighting each other would be, I don't know if you like that show, Man versus Beast, but I remember watching that guy and he's like wandering around and he's thirsty. And in this show, he's left out in the wild. He's supposed to fend for himself. So he sees this puddle of water and he's so thirsty. He says, I'm going to drink that. And then, of course, the danger is if he drinks that it's poisonous or it has some sort of bacteria in it, that if he ingests it, he'll die. And so, or at least get very sick. And so watching that, I remember thinking that's a perfect example of sort of the fight between the appetitive and the rational, because the brain is like, hold on, don't drink that. That is not good for you. You can get really sick. And the stomach is like, oh, I want that so bad. I need it. Okay. So that's a pretty classic conflict right there. Things become more complex when we introduce thumos, or the spirited part. That is the part of the soul that exists between the rational and the appetitive. And you and I might have a hard time understanding what the spirited part means on its own, but let's give it a try. It's the most elusive part of our soul, the hardest you could describe. You could see it as shame. It's not shame, but what I mean is shame is a thumos reaction. It's anger at ourselves when we yield to desire that we shouldn't. Another example might be, I'm trying to think. So it's not totally rational because it involves emotions, and it's not always motivated by rational moral principles. On the other hand, I don't think that you would say it's purely about desire. And especially, when you think about the basic natures of desires like food, sex, shelter, etc., etc. So let me tell a story that I think might help understand the spirited part. I have this professor that I worked for before I came here, and he was a really brilliant guy. And he had grown up, you guys probably don't know this show at all, but there's a show on ABC that was called The Goldbergs, and they were like in New Jersey or something. And the boys in that show, the teenagers, used to always go stand in front of the gas station, the Wawa, and they would wait for people to like buy them beer, since they were underage, and they would drink Slurpees and pick up magazines, nudie magazines. And so my friend that I used to work for, talked he would talk about how when he was in high school, him and his buds would just go stand in front of the Wawa and wait for people to buy them beer, and they just kind of shoot the shit. And They didn't really want to do anything else but that, anything more than that. And for him, as he got older, he found that less and less satisfying, but he wasn't really sure what would be satisfying. And so he started college, and he had this one teacher who was just amazing. I met the teacher once, and he really was amazing. He changed his life in a lot of ways. But what I remember my friend describing that reminds me of the Dumas is that when he met this man, everything that this guy was and the choices he was making, my friend had this sort of movement in his soul that made him say, I want to be that. I'm going to strive to be that. It's like a striving. I'm going to embody that as well. And so it elicits this sort of force, this connectedness. Another example of Dumas would be just really natural one is like if somebody insults your mother, odds are you're going to experience that movement of the soul that's like something has to be done about this. I have to act on this right now. It's not just anger. It's more than that. It's basically, you might think of it as what propels us, what compels us. And it's neutral. It doesn't have its own value. It has to be attached to something good to be good, and attached to something bad to be bad. Um, so, what you see at the end when we're talking about the city or we're talking about the soul, a just city or a just soul is one in which the guardian class, the rational part, is the ruler. They make the decisions about what is good, not just for their part of the soul or their part of the city, but for the whole. The auxiliaries team up in a just soul or a just city with the guardians to sort of execute the plan, to make it work. And then the moderate, the part of the city that is metal, the lowest metal, the bronze part, they sort of receive the direction of these two guiding forces, right, and moderate themselves. So I guess you might say this is another time to return to the concept of courage. What you see in this case is then that in the just city or the just soul, courage is the thumotic part being able to accept the decisions of the rational part of the city or the soul for the good. And I think, just to bring it down a little bit to earth again, if we were people who are going through a tough time and we're having to make a tough decision between something just and unjust, part of what helps us to make that good decision is to be able to have Dumas propel us to it. It's not enough just to know what you should do. You have to have something that is pulling you forward, that is allowing you to go the distance. And that's where Dumas comes in. It's not just enough to identify with your brain, oh yeah, that's what I should do. Okay? That's what I'm telling you. So it turns out then that justice is the virtue that allows all the other virtues to work together. So justice is the highest virtue, and it's the one that every other virtue is dependent on. And if you don't have justice in the city or in the soul, you're not going to have any other virtue. Also, it turns out that justice is the health of the soul. So what is injustice then? In the city, it's strife, disorder, civil war, because all of the parts are not acting as a whole. They're fighting each other. Injustice is licentiousness, cowardness, and ignorance in the individual soul. At this point, I think it's fair to say that Socrates has moved beyond the definitions of justice that we started out with Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus, and he's more focusing on the definition of justice in the soul. What this means for politics, we're going to have to spend some time on, okay? And that's going to be hard. So right now, let's just take a little break, and then we'll get started.